Okay.
Where are we up to?
We are up to page Dalet Amud Bet. If you're following in the art school, that is 4B4. The Gemara says as follows. It's at the if you're trying to find it, it's roughly a few, like 4 or 5 lines down from the bottom. Okay. Megillah b'Shabbat lo karina. You see that? Or if you're following in the English, Megillah b'Shabbat, it's at the top of the second column. Okay?
Where is it?
Yeah.
Oh, in Hebrew, where are you?
Dekuli alma. You see that? Dekuli alma. Everybody holds. Yeah, that there's no
Oh, with the little gmail on top. Yeah.
You got it?
Yeah.
Okay. Says the Gemara. Dekuli alma miha Megillah b'Shabbat lo karinan. Everybody holds, whether you push it to Thursday or you push it to Friday, either way, we all hold that Shabbat we're not reading. And the question is why? What's this reason? My ta'ama. Amar Rabba. Rabba taught us. Hakol chayavim b'kriyat Megillah. Everyone has an obligation to kriyat Megillah. But not everyone is familiar with the laws of reading the Megillah. Therefore, we're worried that the guy, because he knows he has an obligation to read, and he also knows he doesn't know how to read, he's going to take his Megillah, he's going to go carry it to the person who's going to teach him how to read, and that's going to be a prohibition of Shabbat. Why? And he's going to walk 4 amot in Rishut Arabim. And the reason why this is a problem, why we specifically stated that the problem is to carry it in Rishut Arabim. How come we didn't talk about carrying it from Rishut Yachid to Rishut Arabim? Taking it from your house and going outside? And the answer is that the Gemara wanted to show that there's no real way around this. Because even if people would not stay in Rishut Yachid, even if they would stay in Rishut Arabim from the night before, and they would be standing in the middle of a field with a Megillah scroll, still they would be unable to get to that person without carrying on Shabbat, because you can't walk 4 amot, which is roughly 8 feet in Rishut Arabim, on Shabbat, because that's breaking a Torah prohibition. Now,
Public place.
is any public domain. There's a big machlok in what constitutes a Rishut Arabim. How many amot wide does a street need to be? How many people need to walk down that street? But that's considered a Rishut Arabim a public place. So since we're worried that the guy's going to carry it in a public place more than 4 amot, the halacha therefore told us, don't do the Megillah on Shabbat at all. Says the Gemara, V'hainu ta'ama, and that's the reason this shofar. Also, when we don't play shofar on Shabbat, V'hainu ta'ama, and that's also the reason dilulav, that we also don't read, we don't shake lulav on Shabbat. Now, what's interesting is that we did not mention milah. Tosafot says, if you look at Tosafot, I want to just look at Tosafot for 1 second. Interesting. You guys see this over here?
We blow on Shabbat is Kippur, right?
No, we do not blow on Shabbat and Kippur.
Wait till
We were after Motzei Kippur we'll blow. Okay? Says Tosafot. Why don't we also list milah? How come milah on Shabbat also doesn't get pushed off, right? Because we're worried the guy's going to carry the knife and get and have someone teach him how to do the brit milah. Milah b'Shabbat en litchot. Chamira, because milah is very strict. The mitzvah of doing Megillah, much more so, only if it's natural on the 8th day, right? So 1 second. We're going to get there in a minute. The reason is because chamira, because milah is so hamur that if you don't do it, you have karet. What happens if you don't do Megillah? Not the end of the world. What happens if you don't do, if you don't do lulav? You broke a mitzvah ta'aseh. You didn't read the Megillah. But a person who doesn't have brit milah, that's associated with the isur karet. Not only that, Tosafot says, shekenichretu alea yud gimel beritot. Hashem made 13 different covenants that all fall on the covenant of a brit milah. So therefore, we see how strict the brit milah is. So therefore, even if it would entail, we're worried that someone might carry, we're going to override the maybe they might and still do the brit milah on Shabbat. Then Tosafot gives a second reason. Vegam en adam mal elaim ken havi baki. Nobody decides, you know what? I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm just going to swipe the guy. I'm going to go find the moel, and he's going to teach me. I'm going to come back home and do it myself. You don't do that yourself. You only have the mohel do it. The mohel knows the laws about keeping his vessels in the place where he's going to do the milah on Shabbat. So since you're only going to do it with the baki, because no one does a brit milah, it's not a DIY item, so therefore, we're not worried about the problem of maybe he'll carry it on Shabbat. Now, the reason why I wanted to show you Tosafot is for two reasons. Number one, because Art Scroll does a beautiful job of telling you what Tosafot says. Take a look down at the bottom. You see that? Tosafot asks why the Gemara did not say the rabbis are concerned about milah. You see that?
Yeah. But it doesn't say he leaves the stuff there.
And what does he say?
It's an expert.
Sorry, number 26. The rabbis were not concerned. Why? Because you're going to leave it to an expert. What does that mean, leave it to an expert? Maybe the expert's going to do that. The answer is the expert knows, okay? Because usually only an expert performs a circumcision due to the life-threatening danger involved. Now, these two reasons of Tosafot, the Art Scroll only brings one. But this reason says, you know why we're not worried about the Gezerah? Because it won't happen. The first answer of Tosafot is telling us something very interesting. It's saying, Milah is so strict that we're willing to risk a maybe might carry. We're not saying everyone's going to carry. We're going to be saying there's one guy who's going to be so excited he's going to forget. So everyone should lose the mitzvah because of one dib who's going to forget. So when it's megillah, when it's lulav, yes. But when it's something as strict as milah, we're not going to take that mitzvah away from everybody because of the maybe might. The reason why I wanted to show you this reasoning is because you see that we would keep it in place even if we were still worried. The second answer of Tosafot says, no, but we're not actually even worried because only an expert's going to do it. But from the fact that you see Tosafot had two different answers, it teaches us that in a scenario where you had something that was so strict like milah, even if we were worried that maybe someone might carry, we would still do it on Shabbat. Let's carry on. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yosef Amar, Rabbi Yosef said, a different reason. Because the poor people, they have their eyes lifted during the time of the Mikra Megillah, and they know that on this day, you're going to read in the Megillah, you have to give Mishloach Manot, you have to give Matanot Le'evyonim. So they know that along with the reading of the Megillah, people are going to be inspired to give them the gifts to the poor. And they're very nervous about that. And since they're very nervous about that, so what do? We want to make sure that on the day of the reading the Megillah is the day you're going to collect. Yani, have you ever gone to a fundraising dinner for a charity where nobody got up and made a speech? If nobody says anything, if there's no video, no one's giving anything. Because you ate dinner, you want to go home. Someone gets up, tells you about the children, about the orphans, about the sickness. Now you're inspired to give. The eyes of the poor are lifted up during the Mikra Megillah to get their money. If we read on Shabbat, when you can't give them the gifts, what's going to happen? There's no emotional connection to the reading. So therefore, you could potentially have the giving on Sunday. But number one, it's not going to be the same amount. And number two, the poor people will have to endure hearing about the gifts that they're not getting, that they're only going to get at a later time. So in order to save the poor from that pain, in order to ensure that they got the maximum amount that would come to them, so we pushed it off from Shabbat to a day in the week where we'd be able to give them those blessings. Tanya Nami Achi, we learned also, like this in a Braita, this concept that Rav Yosef just taught us. Not that it's a mitzvah, not that this is the reason why you push it off from Shabbat, but this idea that we're sensitive to that. Even though in the villages, the people push the reading earlier. Let's say it's on a Tuesday. They push it earlier to a Monday on an assembly day in the villages. Govin bo bayom. Still, even though Purim is really a later day, and the other mitzvot of Purim will not transport to this day. Only the Mikra Megillah. When they move reading to Monday, we move gift to the poor to Monday. Govim bo bayom. Only gifts to the poor. We'll see in just a second. Govim bo bayom. Umichalkim bo bayom. And you give it out on that day. We collect on that day because we want to make sure they're giving in a generous way, and they give it out on that day because we want to make sure that they have it on the day that they heard about it. The Gemara says, what do you mean? Af al pi. Af al pi she'amiru. Even though we said that you move it, it's only because, adraba, mishum de'amiruhu. Because we said to move it to Monday. That's why this halakha enters. And as the Gemara and says, you're right, Ela, what should it say? V'amiru. What it's trying to say is ho'il v'amiru. Since we said that we moved the day a few days earlier to the day of assembly, makdimim liyom ha'kenisa. Therefore, also govim bo bayom u'michalkim bo bayom. You distribute on that day mipnei sha'aniyim she'eneim sha'aniyim. The eyes of the poor are nisuot b'mikra megillah, lifted up, hoping for that day, the mikra megillah. Now, what did we just prove from here? We did not prove that on Shabbat you move to another day. It doesn't mention Shabbat here. It's actually talking about a case where they moved it from Tuesday to Monday. But you see that the collecting and the giving out are hitched to the reading. Why? Because we're worried about the eyes of the poor. So too, says Rav Yosef, I'm going to take that logic one step further. If these two things are inextricably linked one to the other, because otherwise the poor lose out. So on Shabbat, when you can't have the reading and the giving out fall on the same day, what do you have to do? You have to move it from Shabbat to the weekday.
You can't raise money on that day, then you have to do it another day.
I don't know if it's a kal vachomer, but it's a binyan av, so to speak. We connect. Same logic applies here.
We raise money on Shabbat all the time.
You're allowed to
Physically
take. You're
giving?
allowed to take. Yes, physically giving.
Give it.
I'll tell you one thing. You don't know if you're not in the shul business. The fact that you raised the money don't mean that you collected it. Okay, let's move on.
With Haron's account.
Let's move on. Okay. Now the Gemara says. Now aval rei kitone pasim, again beautiful. Aval but simcha en anoeget ela bizmana. So when you just moved mikra megillah to another day, the simcha, the joy though, which means the feasting, the drinking, all those things that we have on the day of Purim, those don't transpose to the earlier date of reading. Now there's a machloket amongst the mefarshim. If this idea is true on a weekday move, Tuesday, Monday, or if it's true about a Shabbat move. Machloket in the poskim. What's really interesting is that we learn out many halachot from the idea that in the Yerushalmi it says that you should move a Seudat Shabbat from Purim to the day earlier. One opinion is if the Seudah is on Shabbat, you move it earlier. So it's not for Shabbat move. It's only for a weekday move that this Gemara just said what you said. So in other words, on a Tuesday, that you move to a Monday. When do we collect the money? Monday. When do we have the party? Tuesday. How about if Shabbat falls out on Shabbat? We move Shabbat now to either Friday or Thursday, machloket. But you move it earlier. When do you collect the money? Friday or Thursday. When do you celebrate?
Friday or Thursday.
Friday or Shabbat, right?
Normally we would say, keep it on Shabbat. That's the day of Purim.
But now we said no.
But there's a machloket if you keep it on Shabbat here. Why? Even though normally we want to leave it on that day, here there's another reason why you can't have it on Shabbat. What's the other reason?
You have to celebrate Shabbat just for Shabbat.
Nailed it! Up top!
Where'd you pull that one out?
This guy is Ketor. This guy, by the way, had that a Gilgul of Ravina. I'm not even joking. Okay? Now,
Walk out.
what's the reason? If you have a Su'udah during the week, everyone can tell, wow, it's Yemei Mishteh V'Simcha. We're having a party, it's a celebration, magnificent. That's what's going on here. We're celebrating Purim. You eat a Su'udah on Shabbat. What does it look like? Su'udah on Shabbat. My friends, I had this only yesterday. My son-in-law, he gave birth. God bless him. He didn't give birth to anything. My daughter, they gave birth, right? The Brit Milah, we all celebrated, fantastic, wonderful. The Pidyon is on Purim.
Wow. That's gezi.
Gezi. Legit, in more ways than one, okay? The Pidyon's on Purim.
Do we cover that here?
By the way, right now we're covering it. This Yerushalmi that says that you can't have the Seudat Purim on Shabbat. Why? Because who could tell that it's a Seudat Purim? The Mefarshim handle, could you make the Pidyon at the same day on the day of Purim? Why? If you make the Pidyon on Purim, what does it look like?
Is it the day of Purim or the night of Purim?
It would be the night, but the night is a problem because it's not yet the full 29 days, 16 hours, 12 hours, and 743 chalakim. You don't have to. You don't have to. But if you want to, Chamovadia says, Tavo alav bracha. Okay? So really, it should be on the day of Purim. But there's a whole question. Could you do a simcha on the day of Purim? Why? Because the Yerushalmi says that if you have a Purim Seudah supposed to be on Shabbat, can't be on Shabbat. What's the reasoning? Because the Seudah is not nikar, that it is for Purim, you think it's just Shabbat. you make a pidyon at the Purim Seudah, which is when it's going to be, even if you didn't, even if you made it earlier, right? But it's actually going to be at the Purim Seudah, right? What's going to happen? It doesn't look like it. So we learn from the Yushami this halakha. However, in the end, Chacham Uvadia rules that a person is allowed to do it, and that's actually what we're going to be doing. So it's going to be a little bit of a crazy year this year. Normally, I have people over for the Seudah. This year, it's going to be a Pidyon. It's going to be Seudat Purim, and then maybe people will come towards the end of the Seudah.
There's no requirement though to have a Seudah as part of the Pidyon. So is that why it's...
Excellent! One of the Svarot, you guys are poskim now. One of the questions that's asked is, when are you not allowed to have a Seudah fall on a Seudah? When there's a Chiyuv. So when this Seudah is a Chiyuv, and this Seudah is a Chiyuv, and you put this Seudah next to this Seudah, one of them, you can't tell. But if Seudah is just like a nice minhag, it's a nice thing that we do, it's a beautiful custom and we should keep it. It's not a problem if you have a have to and a should. It's a problem if you have a have to and a have to. Since on the Pidyon, the Seudah is a should, not a have to, therefore, that's one of the reasons Chacham Uvadia uses. So here we go. You see, we're learning Gemara about the Seudah, Yerushalmi, and it turns out that it's relevant immediately in this synagogue, in my family. Shtabach Shemo. Okay, let's carry on.
You use English words to explain it.
Thank you. Okay. The Gemara now continues. Gemara says, Amar Rav taught us, Megillah Bizmana. If you read the Megillah in its time, what does that mean? Generally, it's understood to mean that Rav was communicating that when you talk about a Megillah that's being read on its day, not a Megillah that was read Shelo Bizmana earlier, like Ya'ani if it was pushed from Tuesday to Monday, okay? Let's say you read it, you pushed it earlier. Korin ota afilu biyachid. You read it even biyachid. In a case where it's in its time, so it's not pushed, you read it even alone. You just by yourself, one guy. Shelo bizmana, but if you're reading a Megillah that was pushed, i.e., pushed to the day of assembly, or according to some opinions, pushed from Shabbat to the weekday, but again, it's Shelo bizmana, the halacha is, then in such a case, we would read be'asara with a minyan. Rav Asi Amar. Rav Asi says, what are you talking about? Ben Bizmana, whether the Megillah is in its proper time, whether it's not in its proper time, it always needs a minyan. You always have to have a minyan of 10 people. What's the logic of having 10 people? The logic of 10 people is the point of the Megillah was for what? Pirsumei nisa, to spread the word of the miracle. You read it by yourself, what kind of spreading? You can't even spread COVID if you're by yourself. So my friends, therefore you have to have a minyan when you're reading the Megillah, ben bizmana, ben shelo bizmana. That's what Rav Asi is telling us, okay? Rav himself said, no, bizmana, you don't need a minyan. Shelo bizmana, you do need a minyan. What's the logic of Rav that the zman, los, not the zman, the time, not the time should make a difference? Either way, the Megillah is about Pirsumei Nisa. Rav says, no. When it's read Bizmana and everyone's reading, the walled cities, the not walled cities, who cares if I'm in my room reading? Everyone's hearing about it anyway, because everyone's reading the Megillah. It doesn't make a difference if I read it with them or not. However, when it's Shelo Bizmana, so there's only a few people. People don't realize this. You used to have a village. How many people lived in the village? Farmers lived in the farm on the suburb of the town. You could have bizarre 12 people living outside in this farm. Everyone has a giant farm. And then the town, they're providing for the town. So what kind of Pirsumei Nisa is there if I'm reading over here in my house? Okay? Makdimin Liyom HaKenisa. I read earlier, so no one in the town is reading. No one in the walled cities is reading. All it is these 12 guys sitting in their farm with their cow Bessie. What kind of Pirsumei Nisa is that?
Why is getting 10 guys together? Why is getting 10 guys together Pirsumei Nisa?
Because a 10 people is considered a minyan, which is like a crowd. How do we know that? Because the pasuk says, no. Where do we know 10 people is a crowd, is a kahal?
Isn't there, I don't know.
The pasuk says about the spies. When the spies come back, God says to Moshe, "Hibadelu mitoch ha'edah hara'azeh." Leave this evil assembly. Now, how many spies were there? 12. How many of them were good? Two. How many of them bad? That means that God called the evil people an assembly. So if you want to know what an edah is, it's an assembly. By the way, just want to show you how we go from one thing to the next to the next. So Pirsumei Nisa is in an assembly. What else do we have? And this is gorgeous. When we make gomel, you have to have a minyan. Why? How do you know? Odeh Adonai b'chol levav. I will thank Hashem with all my heart. Besod, in the heart of, amidst Yesharim, the righteous. Ve'edah. How many is Edah? So again, you find that Edah is teaching you the 10. That's how you know that a gomel also needs a minyan. Let's carry on. So Rav says, in the zman, in the time, it's you could read it biyachid. Not in the time, you could read it. You need to have a minyan. However, the Gemara says, Hava uvda. There was a time, an actual case came down to the realistic scenario. Rav, it was Megillah during its time, and they had less than a minyan, and Rav said, guys, we need a minyan. Asiri Kodesh, go get us another 10th guy. So you see, even Rav himself agreed to Rav Asi that you need a minyan. Now, I always wondered about what this means. Because maybe...
Before that you read it privately.
No, that's what the Gemara is saying. That when it came down to action, even though he argued with him in logic, came down to action, he didn't rule like himself. Because he himself went out and got 10 guys. Now, here's my question. I don't know what that proves. Because really, maybe all that's saying is that Rav was trying to do the mitzvah in the best possible way. Yes, there's a Pirsumei Nisa. I could do more Pirsumei Nisa. In fact, how do I know that there's a law on top of Pirsumei Nisa to have more Pirsumei Nisa? Anyone know?
Hidur?
What Hidur? Which Hidur? There's an idea. There's a concept in halakha called Birov Am, with more people, Hadrat Melech. That means if I have 10 people, or I could have 100 people, what's better? 100 people. So if you could have a minyan with 100 people in it, or if you have 10 minyans with 10 people in it, better to have a minyan with 100 people. Why? Birov Am, more people, Hadrat Melech is the glory to the king. So therefore, what does this prove? Rav says, in its time, we have Pirsumei Nisa. But if I have 10, I have double Pirsumei Nisa. Double, your refreshment. So you don't really see that Rav held like Rav Asi from here. So it's a little bit, it struck me that when the Gemara seems to say that Rav did like Rav Asi, maybe he didn't, and he would have been happy to read it biyachid, but because he had the ability to get a minyan, why not? Okay, let's move on. The Gemara says, Umi Amar Rav Hachi. I don't think you should take a picture of this. I don't think you should take a picture of this. Oh, okay, just making sure. Charles might feel bad that we're not at his thing, so maybe no photo evidence. No photo. Umi Amar Rav Hachi. Did Rav actually say this? V'ha'amar Rav Yehuda, Bereder Rav Shmuel Bar Shelat. Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Shmuel Bar Shelat, said, Mishmei Rav in the name of Rav. Purim shechal liot b'Shabbat. Purim falls on Shabbat. Erev Shabbat zmanam. Erev Shabbat is the time to read the Megillah. Remember we talked about it. If it falls on Shabbat, you move back to Erev Shabbat. Okay, so therefore what? What does that say? What does that communicate? Erev Shabbat Zmanam. What does it mean, Erev Shabbat Zmanam? V'ha-Shabbat Zmanam. You just said if it falls out on Shabbat, Erev Shabbat Zmanam. Erev Shabbat is not Zmanam. So what did he mean when he said Erev Shabbat is its time? Erev Shabbat is its delayed or its pushed off time. The Gemara says, El alav hachi ka'amar. What Rav must have meant to say was Shelo bizmanam kizmanam. Right? That the Megillah is read. When we read the Megillah, and it's not in its actual time, what do you usually need? You usually need yachid for zmanam and plural in enozman. So he must be mazmanam afilu biyachid af shelo bizmanam afilu biyachid. He must have been saying, right, when the Megillah is read and it's not private time and it's not proper time, even in that case, it could be read privately. So what Rav was saying, what was his chidush? He said Shabbat is its time, but not on Shabbat is also its time. He equated one to the other. It must be that he's saying if he held in one place Yachid, that he was holding Yachid in both places. If that case, it seems to be that the Gemara is saying differently to what Rav said earlier. The Gemara says, no. Le'inyan mikra Megillah ba'asara. What it means is with regards to reading Megillah with 10. Isn't that what we're trying to say? Elamai Erev Shabbat zmanam. What do we mean to say when we say Erev Shabbat is its time? Lafuke midirabi. It's come against the opinion of Rabbi. The Amar, Rabbi said, the hoil and the nitchu ayarot mimkomam. Once we push the cities from their time, yidachu liyom hakinisa. We push them to a day of assembly. So if for whatever reason you have to push off the cities from their time, we don't push them to Friday, we push them to Thursday, the same time as the Kifarim. Hakamash malan, Rav was telling us the Erev Shabbat zmanamhu. He was telling us a separate law. This doesn't negate what we said earlier in the name of Rav. What Rav was actually coming to tell you was, remember when we said if it gets pushed from Shabbat, it could either get pushed to Friday or it could get pushed to Thursday. Rabbi Yehuda said it gets pushed to Thursday. Rav is telling you, Erev Shabbat Zmanam, Erev Shabbat is its time, and not what's it called, and not the other one. Okay? Sorry, go ahead.
Thursday?
And not Thursday, correct. Okay? Let's move on. The Mishnah says, we're going to go until 7:15, we said exactly. The Mishnah continues, the Mishnah says, okay? Ezuhi ir gdola. So we mentioned already that there are walled cities. Walled cities are in a category of their own. Okay? Why? Because they always read on the 15th. When do the unwalled cities read on? The 14th. So, but that's only which cities? The big ones. The small cities, if it does not fall out on a Monday or Thursday, makdimim liyom hakinisa. They move back to the time of assembly. So that means that there's a difference between a small city and a big city. So what is a big city? Ezuhi igdola. What is a big city? Koshi yesh ba'asara batanim. They have to have in it 10 people that don't do anything. What does that mean, 10 people don't do anything? We already explained. It means that they sit and learn. And we already explained that it means not that they happen to learn, but that they're being paid to do so, and it's not something that happens by itself. Pachot mikan, if there's less than 10, hareh ze kfar, it is considered a village. And therefore, in a scenario where you have a city, you might have a city with 8 million people in it, okay? Doesn't have a kolel, it's considered a village, and they read earlier in the Yom HaKinisa. Wild.
Even if they have regular minyans and all that?
Oh, so you already touched on the Gemara earlier. We just had this. What if you have a city, a kfar, that doesn't have a Yom HaKinisa? What if you have a village and there is no assembly day?
Okay.
Do you go back to Monday or Thursday? We said no. Why? Because the whole thing was enacted for their benefit. If there's no assembly day, so there's no point in bringing it earlier, so we're not going to make it earlier. So in
don't have to make it early.
So in a scenario where there's no assembly day, right? So there would be no such concept. If you're actually in a giant city that's called a kfar, a village, only because it doesn't have a kolel in it, but they are their own assembly day every day of the week, right? So there would be no making it earlier. Okay?
So then it doesn't matter if they have 10 or not. If they have 8 million people, let's just say.
Correct, but it's not the reason why they're not makdim. It's not because they're a big city and they have the halacha. It's because they really are their village, but they have no reason to make it earlier. Got it? Okay. Says the Gemara. Ba'elu amiru makdimim v'lo ma'achrim. With regards to these things we said, okay, makdimin, you bring it earlier, v'lo ma'achrim. You make always the mitzvah, you always bring it to an earlier day, and you don't go later. Avazman atzeh kohanim, v'tisha b'av, chagiga, v'hakel, ma'achrin, v'lo makdimin. There's certain things that when we have a conflict, as an example, when Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbat, when do we make Tisha B'Av? Sunday. How come you don't make Tisha B'Av on Thursday? Okay? Same thing with the Atzeh Kohanim, when it's a time for them to bring the wood offering, or when it's a time for them to bring the Korban Chagiga, or Hakel to come and gather in the Beit HaMikdash. All those things, Machrin, V'lo Makdimin, you push it off, and you don't bring it earlier. Afal Pisha Amru Makdimin V'lo Machrim, even though we said this idea, Makdimim v'lo ma'achrim, mutarim behesped ubeta'anit umatanot le'evyonim. So even though we said this idea that you don't go earlier, shamru makdimim v'lo ma'achrim, you don't go later, mutarim, you're allowed behesped ubeta'anit umatanot le'evyonim. So now you're in a day that the megillah was pushed earlier to. So there's a law that you can't do certain things on holidays. You can't do a ta'anit. You can't do a eulogy if someone passes away. You can't do certain things on an earlier day. Matanot le'evyoni. Certain things you can't do on an earlier day. Says the Gemara, says the Mishnah. But even though this day we now moved it earlier, you're allowed to do those things on the day the Megillah is read. So you have a weird scenario where you read Megillah on the Monday, and then you go straight to a funeral and they're doing eulogies. Why? Because the fact that the Megillah is brought earlier doesn't mean that that's Purim day. And what's the proof? Simcha mishteh, where does it stay? In its place. Why are we doing the gifts to the poor earlier? Because we said their eyes are lifted, you're going to get less, for whatever reason. Okay? Let's move on. Okay, we only have 1 more minute. Says the Gemara, let's stop here because this is already a little bit more involved. Baruch Adonai Le'olam.